I'm Marlo Blue, and you're listening to Report and Interview. Tonight, we speak with William Isaacs, Senior Manager of Florida-based FTI Consulting, author of Senseless Panic, How Washington Failed America, and former chairman of the FDIC during the first term of the Reagan administration. Mr. Isaacs, thank you for joining us. Your tenure at FDIC from 1980 until 1985 was through an incredibly chaotic economic period with massive bank and savings and loan failures, high unemployment rate numbers of up to 25%, and a housing bubble that burst. What do you think went right when you were head of the FDIC, and what do you think went wrong?
Marlo, it's really good to be with you. And by the way, I was at the FDIC from 1978 through 85. I was chairman from 1980 through 85. I was actually appointed to the FDIC board as a Republican member by Jimmy Carter, and then when Ronald Reagan was elected president, I was named chairman. I'd say our signal accomplishment during the 1980s was unlike this time around, we didn't create a panic. We handled far more bank failures. I believe this time around we've had something on the order of 400 bank failures in this country in the past 3 years. In the 1980s, we had some 3,000 bank and thrift failures, including many of the largest banks in the country, including 9 out of the 10 largest banks in Texas. So it was a very, very difficult period with lots of problems, and I think they were handled well. The public.
How do you think banking is holding up in general in America now? And are we on the right track? Are banks seeking the right projects to put money into?
Right now, the banking system is still recovering from the 2008-2009 financial crisis and panic. It has strengthened considerably. Our banks have a lot more capital today than they had a couple years ago. They have a lot more liquidity. Deposits are high. Loans, unfortunately, are not growing very rapidly, which means the banks are sort of awash in cash and liquidity. And I believe the banking system can never be a lot stronger than the economy. The banking industry, which a lot of people don't seem to understand today, that the banking industry can't be a lot stronger than the economy, and the economy can't be a lot stronger than the banking system. So when we decide we're going to punish the banks, we are actually punishing ourselves because we are impeding economic growth. And no, I'm not happy with where we are today. I think we are not headed in the right direction with this economy. We have a severe financial crisis that we simply have to face up to and move beyond if we're going to have
Let me ask a little about the
in
Federal
this country.
Reserve. What are your thoughts on the Federal Reserve and how it's a lender and banker of last resort? Is that working?
I have a very high regard for the Federal Reserve as a central bank. I think it has made a number of mistakes in the regulatory arena. I don't believe it has provided the kind of systemic oversight that was needed to prevent the abuses that took place and resulted in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And I also think the Fed has done a terrific job in trying to restore the economy and keep it from sliding into a depression. I'm not a fan of current monetary policy, however. I don't think that having interest rates in the vicinity of 0% is healthy or sustainable. I don't think that I'm puzzled by the Fed's latest thing called Operation Twist, where it's investing heavily in long-term bonds. I don't know of anybody in the country who would intentionally go out and buy long bonds right now, but the Fed is. I don't know how that works. I don't know how that does anything but loses the Fed a lot of money, and I don't see how it lifts the economy. We need to get to a more normalized monetary policy as soon as possible, in my judgment. That would be helped a lot if our politicians would face up to the fiscal crisis and get the budget deficits headed in the other direction.
May I ask you what you think about Sheila Bair? How does she rate?
Sheila was chairman of the FDIC during a very difficult period. I think she is very competent. She's a friend. I like her. And I believe she She saw some things sooner than others did. For example, the housing crisis, she was early to call it and try to get people to focus on it. Unfortunately, not very successfully. We didn't get people's attention on it early enough, and even today we aren't doing much about it. The housing markets are just drifting. Fannie and Freddie are sitting there in government conservatorship, and nobody seems to have a plan for dealing with them. So I think Sheila did a very good job during her period at the FDIC, and was a voice of reason, and called some things early, and also has been very tough on getting bank capital increase, which I support. But still, one person can't do it alone, and one institution can't do it alone. We need our government to, as a whole, start acting in a much more responsible way.
What do you think of her attempts to expand the power of the FDIC during her chairmanship?
I don't think she really did attempt to expand the power of the FDIC. It's interesting, whenever you get into a difficult period, a very difficult period in the financial system and the economy, as we did during my tenure in the 1980s, and during my successor's tenure in the late 80s and early 90s, Bill Seidman. Whenever you get into a period like that, there is always a lot of tension between the FDIC and the other agencies, because the FDIC has got the responsibility for cleaning up the mess and paying for it. So the FDIC is always in favor of taking stronger action more quickly, and that leads to a lot of clashes between the FDIC and say the Federal Reserve and the Controller of the Currency and state banking departments. But to me, that's healthy. That's healthy tension. That's the check and balance in the system, and I think we'd be much worse off without it.
I'm going to ask one more time, and you can refuse to answer if you like. But how do you think banking is holding up in general? Are banks set up to lend to the highest value project needed for this country's best interest for right now, or are they still biased by old-fashioned business models?
I'm not sure I understand that question, and maybe that's why I didn't give you as full an answer previously. But let me just say that I believe that banks are highly incented to lend money. That's how they make money. But they have to select projects that are likely to succeed, because the banks can't just hand out money and not get it back with a rate of interest. And so if there are projects that we need whose economic viability is not readily apparent, but they might be good for the long-term interests of the country, that's a government function. You go to the taxpayers, the Congress, and explain why it is we need to invest in this project for the long-term interests of this country. And then people are going to have to take a vote. But that is not something that the private banking system can do. Banks they really do want to lend money, but they want to lend money to people who are going to pay it back.
Mr. Isaacs, we've had such a horrible time with bad paper, as you know. How much of this is the general population's fault, or is it?
Well, we have so many people to blame for where we are, but I do think that we all have to take some responsibility. I think we all, and I don't buy that literally all of us, but too many of us lived beyond our means for too long. We borrowed too much money. We got way over leveraged and went out and bought 2 or 3 homes on speculation or whatever. We ran up too big a credit card debt. I think we all got carried away, and as I said, not literally all of us, but too many of us. I also believe we voted for members of Congress, and we urged them to spend more money than we were willing to pay in taxes. We had all sorts of ideas for things we wanted to have the government contribute money toward, and we weren't willing to pay for them, so we allowed our politicians to run up excessive debt, way beyond what we can afford as a nation. And so I think in those senses, I think we all have responsibility, and now we need to take action to correct that. We really need to send people to Washington with the direction to get the debt down, to get the fiscal crisis resolved. And if we do that, I think there's a wonderful future ahead of this country. I think we're still the strongest nation in the world if we get this fiscal crisis under control, and we can do that. It's not rocket science. It's actually pretty easy, but it takes a lot of discipline, and that's what I hope the public will do, is send people to Washington who have that discipline.
Let's talk a little bit about Senseless Panic, how Washington failed America. What other forms of correction do you suggest?
First of all, I explain what went wrong this time and how it differed from the 80s, how we created a financial panic this time around needlessly, and we inflicted all sorts of harm on the economy and the financial system that we didn't need to inflict. And it's really an interesting read. I wrote it. You don't have to be an expert to understand it. It's written so that everybody can understand it, because I think it's very important that we all learn more about our economy and our financial system and how they work, and what we need to do to keep it under control. And I do recommend a number of changes, reforms, to make sure this never happens again. I've actually, in my lifetime, been involved in 3 major financial panics or crises in this country. 1972 to 74, a massive real estate collapse. And then in the 1980s with the banking and S&L problems that were so widespread, and then again in 2008 and 2009. I've been involved in 3 of these. I don't want to see anymore. And we need to reform our regulatory system, first of all. And that's something that this Dodd-Frank reform legislation did not do. It did not address the fundamental problems that are wrong with our regulatory system. It's way too fragmented, it's way too politicized, and we need much better and more effective regulation. And this reform law that Congress passed a year or so ago does not do it. It probably makes it worse. And they don't address the other issues. Freddie and Fannie, as I said, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are still out there in government conservatorship. We don't have any plan for dealing with them. We don't have any plan for getting the housing crisis under control and stabilize and get the housing markets growing again. We just aren't taking the steps that we need to take, and we don't have any plan in place to correct the fiscal crisis. So that's why I think it's a very important election next year, and I hope everybody will get out there and participate in it and send us some representatives in Washington who will get these jobs done.
May I have your thoughts, please, on the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act? Do you think that was good for the country, or has it helped cause the current financial crises?
I was in favor, I'll admit, I was in favor of the repeal of the Glass-Steagall law, which Gramm-Leach-Bliley did. 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. It separated Wall Street from Main Street, essentially. It separated the Wall Street investment banking firms from the commercial banking firms that you see in the various towns and cities around the country. They could not, the two groups were separated. They couldn't have both of them in the same firm. And I thought that was a good idea. That law was enacted back in the Depression. I thought it outlived its usefulness, and I thought that if we got rid of Glass-Steagall, that we would create more competition in the investment banking area and better pricing and more availability of lending and so forth. And I thought we were smart enough to regulate those big complex firms. I look back on it now, I believe it was a mistake, and that we don't have a regulatory system that's up to the task of regulating these big and complex firms. And I also I don't see that they necessarily created a more competitive banking environment. So I must say though there are people that I respect who argue just the opposite, who say that the problem is we never should have had Glass-Steagall in the first place, and that what we did is we created Wall Street firms that were not subject to proper regulation the way commercial banks are. And if we put these activities all together in a commercial banking type firm that's regulated properly, we wouldn't have had these problems. So I think there are two sides of that debate. But I tell you, the one thing that both sides share in common, and that is that if we don't learn how to regulate these firms, then we're in trouble again. We've got to have a much stronger, better smarter regulatory system than we have right now, and that's what Dodd-Frank does not give us.
Of course, right now, Occupy Wall Street is happening all over the nation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not really. I understand the frustration, and I mean, a lot of people are frustrated, and from all spectrums, from all of the entire political spectrum, from the right to the left. You know, I was very much opposed to the TARP legislation. I actually went to Congress at the request of a number of members of Congress, and I fought against it. I thought that the TARP was a mistake, and wasn't going to do any good, and it would create a lot of animosity on the part of taxpayers, all of which came to pass. TARP didn't do any good, despite the people who tell you it did. They flat out didn't do any good. Other steps we took, which I had been recommending, are what made the difference, not TARP. TARP was ill-conceived and poorly administered and should never have been used. Now, it didn't cost as much money as it might have because they didn't use it to buy $700 billion of toxic assets from Wall Street firms, which was the original intention of it. And I argued very strongly against that. So I understand the frustration. I share the frustration. This crisis should not have happened, and TARP should not have been enacted. And so I'm with them. I'm with them in terms of the frustration that I feel, whether it's the Tea Party group or the Wall Street occupiers. But I don't know that we're going to resolve anything by camping out on Wall Street. I think that what we've got to do is we've got to get busy in the coming elections and get people elected who are actually going to make some changes.
For the record, would you like to enumerate some of the changes you did ask the committee for?
You mean in when I was fighting TARP? Sure. I suggested that the FDIC ought to declare an emergency and agree to protect all depositors from loss during the period of the crisis, so there wouldn't be a panic among depositors in the banking system. The FDIC actually did that after TARP was enacted, but it wasn't as a result of TARP. It was because people realized that needed to be done. That should have been done earlier than it was done, and we wouldn't have needed TARP. I also suggested that the SEC and the Financial Accounting Standards Board should suspend mark-to-market accounting, which they put into place in the 1990s. It was a very serious mistake. We had mark-to-market accounting. Basically, mark-to-market accounting says that banks have to continually mark their assets to whatever the current market price is. That doesn't work when the markets stop functioning, which they did during 2008 and 2009. The markets simply stopped functioning, and it caused the banking system to have to write off, needlessly, $500 billion of capital. We had mark-to-market accounting during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and in 1937, the Roosevelt administration outlawed it and put into place a historical cost counting system. And that was a much better system, and the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and the SEC abolished that system and went to mark-to-market. Didn't abolish it, but they moved to mark-to-market accounting in the 1990s. Terrible mistake. They should have suspended it in 2008, which is what I was advocating. I also, the administration also, in 2007, the SEC abolished the Depression-era restrictions on short selling, and I urge that those be put back into place, which they did after the TARP program was enacted, but not because of TARP. They just simply realized they had to put back in place these restrictions on short sellers. I also felt that the FDIC should recapitalize whatever banks it needed to recapitalize in order to save the system, which is what they did also, because that's what they finally decided to do with the TARP money. But we didn't need the TARP. The FDIC could have done it without the TARP. So they actually adopted everything that I called for. By the way, that was in a Washington Post article on September 27, 2008, which is why members of Congress called me up to ask me how, to come to Washington and talk about why we didn't need TARP. And so I had proposed all these things. They actually all happened eventually, but it took way too long to put them into place. And And instead we got TARP, and we caused tremendous anger and political backlash in the country that was not necessary.
Mr. Isaacs, thank you for joining us. I'm Marlo Blue. We'll see you next time.